Okay, now in this section, we're going to talk about my background before I came into a relationship with Christ. Why in the world would you want to listen to me? A guy who didn't even open the Bible until I was approaching 40 years of age. After World War II, my parents and the schools in America began setting the Bible aside. My family never went to church, unless invited by a relative for a potluck or perhaps a wedding or a funeral. America was a good nation after World War II with good people, and God had delivered us, so all is well for good people, right? Who needs church? Well, for me, by the 7th grade, the Bible had been removed from schools. By the 9th grade, God was relegated to mostly a myth, and simply one of many belief systems of mankind. In high school, I still thought of myself as a pretty good person, still figured God was needed for the really bad people, and I never gave God too much thought. I did attend a couple of youth activities at church because my friends went there and there were girls there. I was taught in school that the Bible was a nice book, but it didn't rise to the level of academic standards for our modern world. I was taught in high school that God and religion were an invention of the superstitions of ancient man, and that we humans are a product of evolution, not the creation of some God. In high school, I was taught the theory of the Big Bang and how all the stars formed from dust from the Big Bang. And then they became elements and they clumped together. Over billions of years, it became stars and planets and dirt. And this dirt eventually sparked into life because of lightning striking it or something like that. And then this early life form mutated and eventually evolved into humans. Any God seemed very distant and not too relevant in my life. Now, after high school, before going into the military, I went to junior college for a couple of years. There I was taught in literature class once again that the Bible was a nice book, but that's all it is, ancient prose. I was taught in anthropology class that religion and God were invented by ancient man to control other people. I was taught in biology class, just like high school, that we're the product of evolution, not the creation of God. And in astronomy class, we learned about the Big Bang and billions of years. My grades in school depended on me accepting all these things, and to be very honest, I didn't really question these things. I never felt a need for God. Then I joined the military. Both in school and the military, I learned that life's about getting ahead, being self-fulfilled, taking control, making money, being popular, all the good stuff the world rewards. Well, in the military, I married. Both of us had just turned 20. She was Catholic and I was Protestant. We knew each other from high school, and I hadn't seen each other for about 8 months while I was in the military in Mississippi. I came home to California, we got married the very next day, and started driving back to Mississippi the day after that. Each of our families complained because we were entering a mixed marriage, Catholic and Protestant. But we agreed that it didn't really matter because neither of us or our parents were actually involved in any church anyway. Both of our sets of parents didn't actually attend church. But both families still thought of themselves as traditionally Christian. And that's because of the family traditions handed down for generations, Catholic or Protestant. Now, after a few years, I planned on getting out of the military as my friends were all getting out early. But as my friends were getting out early, I instead got orders to go to Thailand in 1968, and I ended up in Vietnam in 1969. If there is a God, what is he doing with me? When I was leaving to go overseas, I had to fill out the death form so that the military would know what to do with my body in case I was killed. And one question was, what religion are you? Well, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Hindu? Well, I knew I was a Christian, of course. My grandfather was a Christian and my aunt was a Christian, so I must be a Christian. Of course, I didn't pray. I didn't read the Bible. In fact, I had never opened a Bible. I didn't go to church and I didn't hang around with anybody but because of traditions, I figured I must be a Christian. A few years later, every one of my friends from Vietnam are dead, either in battle or by weird lung and bone cancers. Still, God has no place in my life, or my family's life, or my friends, or my workplace life. Then on Christmas Eve at age 24, My wife was about 8 months pregnant with our son. My friend and I were coming home from work and his car wouldn't start. So I was helping him get his car started. We were over in a parking zone and I was pushing his car from behind to try to bump start it. Well, I was pushing his car and out of nowhere a drunk driver came along, veered out of the lanes of traffic over into the parking zone and crushed me between the bumpers of his car and the car of my friend at 40 miles an hour. My back was crushed, my legs and arms were all crushed. The exhaust pipe of the car in front went right through my left knee. I bled out laying in the street. Eventually the highway patrol arrived and pronounced me dead. The highway patrol knew the point of impact because of where my laced up shoes were. They were still at the point of impact. I popped right out of my laced up shoes and my body was about 100 yards down the road. The highway patrol went to tell my wife and told her to go to the hospital to be able to claim the body. The meat wagon arrived and pronounced me dead and took me to the hospital morgue. At the hospital, the doctor in charge pronounced me dead. Now at the hospital, it required 2 doctors to sign off, and so another doctor came in and said, well, let's stick some fluids in him and see if there's a pulse, and if not, then I'll sign off. Well, after finding a pulse, I was laid out on a board and tied down so as not to move because my spinal column had been crushed. I probably would never walk again. They also decided to hold off on amputating my left leg where the exhaust pipe went through because they wanted to avoid any more shock to my body. Even if it could heal, I would probably never walk right anyway, if I could walk at all. God was not recognized by our families, just science and medicine. I had no health insurance as I only worked for my company for 1 year and 51 weeks. And back then you had to have 2 years on the job. I was 1 week short. I healed, and without health insurance I had to return to work at a desk job after about 5 months, still in a wheelchair and leg and arm casts. After 2 years, the casts were finally all removed. And my only limitation today after all this is minor arm movement in my left arm. I can't turn my hand like this. That's the only thing I have. Glory be to medicine and the doctors. Neither me or my family thought about opening a Bible or a God. American school education had taught us that evolution was a fact and God was only a myth. Now, a couple of years later, my marriage had failed. Divorce is very painful. It rips people apart. None of our families were involved in church or even considered church. Well, then I married a woman who was a Protestant. No more mixed marriages for me. And her parents were also Protestants. Of course, once again, because of tradition, we all thought of ourselves as Christians, but none of us were attending any church or reading the Bible or praying or hanging around with anyone who did. We were all doing our own thing, satisfying ourselves, and after a few years, I was divorced again. My marriage had failed again. Very painful. Ripped apart again. And while the second force was being processed, even though I had been taught in school that the Bible was bunk and that God was an invention and I was just an accidental product of evolution, I began to question all those teachers I had in school. I'm a little older and experienced now, and my studies in college and my studies in electronics had led me into deeper science and math studies. And I now began studying science even more, and I began questioning evolution and DNA science. These were all theories. And even today, as I record this in 2020, there is still no hard evidence. I also questioned what kind of a good person I really was, and I questioned all this self-fulfillment stuff about money and jobs and status. Is that all there is, or is there more to life? Is making money and spending money and then making more money and spending more money until someone dies, is that all there is? Why are so many of my friends dead from Vietnam and cancers while I'm still here and healthy? I decided to search for truth, and I began to actually attend a church. A woman entered my life who was also struggling with life and God's will in her life, and we began discussing God. And through life's experiences and discussions with her, she was a great influence for God. God gave me ears to hear. I began to understand, and guess what? As I was approaching 39 years of age, I finally opened a Bible. This lady, Monica, would eventually become my bride. And because of my background in knowing people in both Catholic and Protestant churches, and because when I was stationed in Thailand and Vietnam, I'd connected with Mormons and Buddhists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, Seventh-day Adventists, Hindus, I was somewhat familiar with a variety of beliefs. In my search for truth, I came to realize that most religions were attempts by mankind to do certain rituals in order to reach God, in order to be good enough. There are even a few Christian churches that prescribe certain things a person must do to be part of God's kingdom. Now, these were all well-meaning people with nice philosophies of life, and they were well-intentioned. But these religions just didn't match up with what the Bible, you see, I started reading the Bible, and what the Bible says in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. Being part of God's kingdom is a free gift, grace. No works can get you in. In fact, the Bible states that our works are as filthy rags over in Isaiah 64, verse 6. Well, next I'm going to discuss my life after Christ in section number 3.